All right, in this video, we're going to run through two sections of the fourth unit of AP World Modern, talking about internal and external challenges to this expanding state power and changing social hierarchies from 1450 to 1750. Start off talking about this theme of governance, and as we're seeing the power of state governments expand and increased centralization, you're going to see a lot of resistance coming from various social, political, and economic groups. In the Americas, also, we're going to see slave resistance movements that will challenge authorities, and that's where we are going to start. As empires are expanding, we're going to see that they're facing resistance from local populations that are challenging their rule. And we see this in Africa. We also see this in the Americas. In West Africa, Anna Nzinga, in a state called Matamba, will lead rebellions against the Portuguese colonies in Africa. In fact, she's going to eventually work with some Dutch to try to strike against their mutual enemies, the Portuguese. In North America, in the British colonies of North America, in British New England, Metacom's War, or King Philip's War, will feature Native American resistance against British colonists in New England. And then in the southwest part of the present-day United States, we see the Pueblo revolts, where Native indigenous Americans of the Pueblo tribes will revolt against Spanish settlers in their territories. With regard to slave resistance, we're going to see this throughout the Americas as enslaved Africans will make attempts to resist their enslavement by European slavers. The Maroon Wars. Maroons were enslaved Africans that had escaped and gone to retreat to the mountains, and they actually established their own communities of escaped slaves in Jamaica, for example. In the 18th century, these Maroons will come down out of their mountains and actually launch attacks in hopes of leading a slave uprising in Jamaica. This will ultimately be put down, but it does give concern to many of these Caribbean islands where the white slave owners are so vastly outnumbered by their enslaved populations. There's countless smaller acts of slave resistance and rebellion, like Yanga's rebellion in 16th century Mexico, where escaped slaves are going to form their own community and ultimately push against their enslavers. The St. John insurrection in the Caribbean, where slaves will organize a revolt against their Danish controllers. And then in the United States, in the 19th century, Nat Turner's rebellion, where he will lead a slave uprising, which will give even wider fears to more slave resistance going forward. With regard to internal resistance to state power, now this is back in the home country. In France, the Fronde is a series of uprisings of French nobles against the continuing growing power of the French king. These will ultimately fail and actually result in even more powerful and more centralized governments. In Russia, we see the same story with the Pugachev rebellion, a peasant rebellion in Russia against the rule of the Empress Catherine the Great. Peasants and serfs and Cossacks rise up against this centralized power of the state and the nobles in Russia. Ultimately, this as well will fail and leads to more state growth. With regard to South Asia, we're going to see a new empire arise called the Maratha Empire, founded by a Hindu group that resisted Mughal rule, particularly of Aurangzeb. Remember, Aurangzeb was that Mughal emperor that started to turn against the earlier tolerance practiced within the Mughal Empire by Shahs like Akbar. This will bring an end to Mughal rule in India. With regard to social interactions and organizations, we're going to see some different handling of ethnic and religious diversity within different empires, usually depending on how diverse those empires actually were. We'll also see new economic and political elites rising around the world, and sometimes new social hierarchies develop. So with regard to some of these tensions that are arising with a rise of new elites. In the Ottoman Empire, for example, through this Devshirme system that creates an elite class of warriors called janissaries and viziers administering the country, we will start to see rising power of these janissaries and viziers, sometimes at the expense of central sultans, central rulers. Remember, we've got a situation here where the sultan often grows up in the palace and never really sees the outside world, while his viziers and his elite warriors are much more worldly and they know what's going on outside those doors. Think of the story in Aladdin, where Jafar, the vizier, can start to dominate the sultan, who is not nearly as knowledgeable of what's going on within his own empire. We also want to look at the treatment of religious minorities, or in the case of the Mughals, majorities. In the Ottoman Empire, there was relative tolerance towards Jews and Christians. Not equal, though. Remember, tolerance doesn't mean equality. They still had to pay that jizya tax. They couldn't hold the top positions in government. The Mughals, however, were quite tolerant of other religions. They would end the jizya for Hindus. They would approve, this is especially under the ruler Akbar, they would approve new church construction. They would be supportive early on of Sikhism. Hindus could serve as zamindars. But this tolerance within the Mughal Empire, as we already said, would start to turn around under the rule of Aurangzeb in the late 1600s. With regard to changing social hierarchies we see around the world, with the rise of the Qing dynasty, we see the rise of a Manchu elite. Remember, the Qing, they were outsiders in China. They were Manchurians. And so the Manchu become the new elite of Chinese society. In Europe, we see a hierarchy establish itself with the royalty at top, a strong, often absolute monarchy at the top, with the landed aristocracy, the traditional noble class underneath them. We will see the rise of a new urban middle class, particularly as we see more merchant wealth being developed and the rise of those that investor class supporting joint stock economy, joint stock companies. So this rise of a new urban middle class, not necessarily economically a middle class, but a new social class between the nobility and the peasant class. Economically, some of this middle class is going to end up being even wealthier than the nobility. Centralized control of larger armies and gunpowder weapons, though, will keep those nobles firmly under that central monarch. Finally, in Russia, we also see a suppression of the noble class, what we call the boyar class. And you see right next to me a picture during the reign of Peter the Great, when those nobles were forced to shave their beards, because of course, having a beard means you aren't quite as sophisticated. I hope that's not true. Nobles were forced to shave their beards and start to wear more Western styles, as Peter the Great would push Russia to being a more Westernized European state. In the Americas, a new social hierarchy is going to develop. It's known as the American caste system, or Las Castas. And this brings new social hierarchies based on the racial divisions that form in North America, as you are having a blending of Europeans and Africans and indigenous Americans in North America. And so we get a hierarchy of social classes, from the peninsulares at top. Those are those Spaniards born over in the Iberian Peninsula of Europe. Under them are the Creoles population. Those are the sons and of those Spaniards born in the Americas, so white people born in the Americas. And then you've got blended race people, mestizos, blended of indigenous Americans and native. The mulatto, blended of Spaniard and African, and then natives and Africans down in the lowest tiers of these social hierarchies. And so we see this new hierarchy develop because you've got new people that never had integrated before. And in Latin America, we are certainly going to see this race-based hierarchy. So the big three, as we leave here, as states grow in size and power, they experience resistance in many forms: local resistance to rule, slave revolts, social uprisings. Some states are more open to accommodating social diversity, while others are going to suppress minority groups. Or in the example of the Mughals, we see more support and then later more repression within the same empire. And the rise of central authority creates new challenges to absolute rule. You start having some resistance within states against that absolutism. We'll talk to you next time.